Thank you. All right. Well, let's just jump into it because, as I mentioned before, we have a little bit shorter time period today, where hopefully we can get through the draft clean air plan. We've been hard at work working on that, developing the draft here, as well as moving forward the electric vehicle blueprint process. And so I'm going to turn it over to Renee Moynihan to walk us through the draft and work through the presentation. So Renee's from Starcrest, as well as Bruce Anderson is from Starcrest as well. They've been helping us with the development. So hopefully they're not new faces to you. Renee?
Yep. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's been a while since we've been in front of this committee, but if you remember, we were having almost monthly meetings to talk about the Clean Air Plan. So hopefully those of you who have gotten a chance to look at the draft, nothing in there was really a surprise to you, because we've been talking about many of these strategies all along the way. But what I'm going to do right now is actually share my screen and share the draft report. Are you guys able to see that? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to try not to make people sick to their stomach as I scroll through here. So if you get motion sickness, just close your eyes. I'm not going to go through page by page, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things about this plan as you start going through and reading it. So the first, there is an introduction that speaks to why the Port of Stockton was developing this clean air plan. And there's also a section that describes the purpose of the plan. And that might be an interesting section for many of you to look at, because it talks about how some of the strategies that are described in this document are going to be put into action. There's different ways that the port can choose to implement some of these strategies: voluntary programs, requirements in the tariff, conditions in new leases, mitigation measures and environmental documents. And then, of course, partnering with other agencies, because there are limitations in many cases to the port's jurisdiction. So that gives you a sense of how the port could use a plan like this to bring about the emission reductions that it's seeking to get for the community. A little bit of background in terms of the need for a plan like this, describing the community in and around the Port of Stockton, describing the sources that we're looking at. This plan is primarily focused on heavy duty trucks, cargo handling equipment, hovercraft, ships, and locomotives, although there are also strategies for the port's own light duty fleet, and then also community mitigation. Also in this opening section, we've got a description of related initiatives. And this part is really important for understanding the context of these strategies. The State California Air Resources Board is very active in pursuing new regulations that are going to reduce emissions, particularly from the freight sector. So we wanted to make sure that, to the extent possible, this plan is really accelerating some of those initiatives. The region also is very active in terms of addressing community impacts, as many of you know, through the AB 617 process. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to make sure that this plan was supporting these other initiatives and providing more detail and context about the port's role in those initiatives as appropriate. And then we also have a description here about the electric vehicle blueprint that Jeff mentioned, which is still in development, but is really supportive around the zero emissions aspect of this plan. And we have tried to provide as much context as possible. So I am going to skip ahead to the actual strategies themselves. Wait, let me do one more thing, sorry. The objectives. So if you remember, and this was a while ago, it was probably almost a year ago, that we talked about the objectives for this plan and the different strategies that, how we're going to evaluate strategies. These objectives are formalized here in this plan. They should look familiar to you since they were vetted through this group already. But as we were looking at the different strategies, we sort of held them up against these different objectives to make sure that they were in alignment. So now, well, actually, before I go to the strategies themselves, any questions on anything in the introduction. And I'm not really able to see very well, so I don't know if people have their hands up or.
We'll let you know. I don't
Okay.
see any hands so far.
Okay, perfect. So let me just get to, everyone close your eyes. I'm going to make you sick. I want to get to the summary of the strategies. So throughout the plan, there's a lot more detail about each of these strategies. This is the high level summary, and we'll just talk about very quickly, the summary of what the strategies are, and then you can go back through the document and get more details. So the first category that we looked at was for trucks, and we have 7 proposed strategies for trucks. The first one is identifying ways to route trucks away from the community and working with city and regional partners to implement those actions. The second is to reduce fugitive dust emissions resulting from trucks. The third is to collaborate with other agencies on anti-idling plans and increased enforcement of idling limits. The fourth is to identify ways to enhance goods movement efficiency and improve traffic flow, particularly around the neighborhoods. 5 is to assist truck operators in securing grant funds for zero emission trucks and infrastructure. 6 is developing the electric vehicle blueprint to facilitate that transition to zero emission trucks. And the final truck strategy is facilitating the development and implementation of zero emission truck transition plans at each facility to make sure that the port's tenants are ready for zero emission trucks in terms of infrastructure. So you might recognize that some of these strategies are right from the community emission reduction plan that was a part of the AB 617 process, and that's not a coincidence, because as I mentioned, we really wanted to align with these other initiatives. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to be supportive of the efforts that have already taken place, because we know there was a tremendous amount of community feedback that went into these other plans. So the other thing you'll notice is that there's not a ton of information, although there's more information in the rest of the document about the specific implementation strategies for these different strategies. And that's something that's sort of the next phase. We've identified the strategies. We know what we want to do. Now comes sort of the rolling up of the sleeves and digging in and doing even more stakeholder outreach and more community engagement to figure out how to actually implement these different strategies. So that said, I'm going to pause there and see if there were any questions about any of the truck strategies or any comments.
Renee, I have a quick comment and just a clarification too, that so we're not sitting on our hands waiting for us to finalize this document before moving ahead with some of these measures. We are currently working with the city and the county to identify alternatives and move trucks away from the adjacent neighborhood and the school. So where we can, we are already moving down that road. So just wanted to clarify that real quick. Mary Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just had a question here. I understand that you don't have ways to implement these strategies yet. Is there a time frame for when the port is going to commit to developing those techniques and measures that will allow for the implementation of these strategies?
We do have ways to implement some of the strategies right now, as I just mentioned, as far as moving ahead with coordinating to reroute some of the trucking routes. So things that are that we can do now, we are moving ahead with. Other things, we're moving on, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But as soon as we get feedback from this group and we finalize the plan and we take it to our board, I think we're talking about is it the first quarter of next year, Renee, that we plan to have this finalized?
Yes, and I will say that we do have more of a specific timeline in terms of what's going to happen immediately, near term, and long term. which strategies are going to be tackled first. We had met with this group several months ago, just before we were putting the finishing touches on this draft plan, and we talked about implementation priorities. And there was a good discussion around the fact that it's somewhat opportunistic. In other words, some strategies are going to be easier to tackle near term, others might take more time. So we want to be sensitive to that. But then that also has to be balanced against where some of the community priorities are. So, as Jeff said, a lot of these strategies are already underway. But some of them will require more discussion with the community and regional partners before they're fully implemented.
Thank you, Mary. Margot?
Yeah, I was just wondering, and maybe I've just forgotten, but the port, do you have a way to facilitate collaboration between the various tenants? Are they working together? Are they working with you, or are you focused on port activities as related to just the port, not the tenants?
All of the above. So through this process and through even developing the Clean Air Plan, we've been reaching out and having a lot more dialogue with the tenants. And I think that shows by the number of tenants actually that are here with us today. So between the blueprint process and the stakeholder engagement that's happening with that effort, as well as the drafting of the Clean Air Plan, we are making our tenants more aware of grant funding opportunities, opportunities for collaboration, such as we've done with SSA Marine on the ZANZEF program. So there is a lot more development going on in discussion and dialogue. In fact, just today we followed up from one of the blueprint meetings and provided our tenants with a bunch of different opportunities for collaboration and grant funding. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Barbara?
Hi. Is there going to be a written comment period or deadline that you want feedback from us? And is there going to be, I mean, you have AB 617, you have this group, but is there going to be some type of community committee that's going to be part of regular review how you meet your goals?
That would be, so I'll answer the last question first. We intend to kind of do the rollout and kind of check in through the Port Outreach Committee. That will be kind of one of the goals there. And then we'd love comments back as soon as possible. I think if we want to show the schedule, let me see if I can. Renee, do you have any thoughts around deadlines for comments?
I think, if we want to get something adopted in the early part of next year, it would be good to get comments before the end of this year. But Barbara, what are your thoughts around how much time you think the community would need to develop some really thoughtful comments?
Oh, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I think good practice is always like 60 to 70 days. Maybe for a document this size, I think it needs to be 4 months when it's a really large EIR, 4 to 6 months. So, but other people may feel differently and they know what's best for their orgs.
Do you think that by the end of this year would be?
I would say with the holidays, it may be a little bit tight. I think I would go into the first 2 weeks of January.
Okay. Okay, I think we can accommodate that. That shouldn't be a problem.
But don't take my word for it. Ask other people here. I don't want to get in trouble.
Well, if anybody else wants to raise their hand and thinks that the middle of January is not enough time, please speak up or raise your hand. Jimmy.
Okay, it didn't have nothing to do with the middle of January, right? It says Trucks 3 collaborate with other agencies on a regional anti-idling plan. There's already a law that trucks are not allowed to idle for more than 5 minutes at any time.
Right.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if that is this going forward, talk about no idling at all, or?
So
um,
that's a great question. So there was a strategy in the AB 617 Community Emission Reduction Plan around, this is more about enforcement of idling, of the anti-idling laws that are already in effect. And ensuring compliance and working with the agencies that have the jurisdiction to do that enforcement, because the port can't enforce those laws itself, but the port can do education around anti-idling laws and can work with its partners.
Okay, all right. Personally, I mean, it starts right here for me, because it's just, we're all about trucking, right? And, you know, I get guys that roll in my yard all the time. They look at me sideways when I tell them to turn their trucks on. You know, and, you know, I know it gets hot out here, but I mean, my guys are on the forklifts all day long. They don't got an air conditioning, so I don't have a lot of sympathy. Turn your truck off. So, all right, that's what I was just wondering.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Matt.
Yeah, there's a button. Well, Jimmy, we appreciate you giving your guys direction. You know, I think to the commenting deadline question, you know, we got a couple of agencies in here. CARB, usually AG looks at these sorts of things. So I think I generally like to see what they have to say first before we come weighing in. So I don't know if you've already had this reviewed by then. Sorry if I should have captured that already.
No, no worries. Does anybody from CARB or the Air District think that the middle of January is a good deadline for finalizing comments? We're gonna put was it Brian on the spot? He's just filling in.
No, Matt always puts me on the spot, so I'm totally used to it. Yeah, I haven't, it's good to see everyone again, though. I haven't seen Matt in a while. I think at least from our end, we can get on this and review it by the end of the year. So I don't know about everyone else, and everyone has a busy holiday season, but I think we have the capacity to get through it. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, that works. And then I had one more question. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just gonna say, if anybody from the Air District wanted to weigh in real quick.
This is Stephanie from the Air District. I think along with what Brian's saying, mid-January sounds doable for the Air District as well.
Perfect. Okay. All right, Matt.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I just like a little buffer after they both weigh in, because you know the issue isn't always just what the port is doing, it's what the people you report to are doing to hold you accountable, or your tenants in particular. And then I had a question for Renee. Was there anything in the Clean Air Plan that maybe identified planning shortfalls in the strategic plan? You know, we had the strategic plan come out before we did the freshest inventory. So I don't know if anything jumped out at you from that.
You know what? I actually don't. Did you come out with this specific plan?
Well,
Jeff?
did you totally delay it, Jeff? I know you had a draft.
Yeah, it's still kind of in the works. It's something that is still on the burner. It's just been pushed a little bit to the back burner, but that is something that we've been prioritizing. And I imagine what my opinion is that we're going to take a lot of these measures from the Clean Air Plan and bring them into the strategic plan. So I don't think the development of the strategic plan, you know, should delay anything. I think that these measures will be included into that process.
Yeah, that's great news. I mean, that was really the primary complaint about, I think we were trying to roll out strategic plan in June of, when was that, 21? Before all this, but good to know. Great, this will inform that.
Yes, absolutely. Mary?
Thanks. I just wanted to remind folks that on this anti-idling, there is a process, and Brian, you can correct me, and thank you so much, Jimmy. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and conscientiousness and willingness to be in uncomfortable situations when you ask somebody to do something that they might not be inclined to do. Anybody can submit a complaint to CARB regarding a excessive idling vehicle. And so, you know, if the port is really committed to this, then, you know, they also have to be able, you know, and fully transparently, you know, turn in a trucker if they're, not complying with the rules, and, leave it as is, who has the authority is CARB, to do with it what they will. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, let me just clarify a little bit. It's not that we do have people on the ground every day who are going around checking for excessive dust, for trucks that are idling, and for visible emissions evaluations. So we do enforce that. We've got signs everywhere that are notifying the truckers so that they should not have any reason to not know that that's the regulation. So yes, we do that. We also do reporting on the drayage truck rule. We have got to record and submit any non-compliant trucks as far as that goes, and so that is also a daily obligation that we take seriously. In the chat, Tanisha has asked if we are aware of EPA Clean Ports funding through the Inflation Reduction Act. Yes, the listening sessions. I am currently, as well as one of our grant folks, is signed up for that program and that listening session on the 6th. So we are watching, and we see a lot of the funding that is out there. We did just get a grant from the Port Infrastructure Development Plan for rail upgrades. We're working on another one for the CALSTA funding that's out there for ports. Some of that will be pushing towards zero emission equipment and continuing to support those efforts. Additional charging infrastructure. We've submitted Energize. We just submitted for an additional, Karen, help me, is it 10 or 20 additional fast chargers? So yes. 14. So we are aware of a lot of the funding, but please, in case something slips by us, feel free to remind us as often as you would like to. Okay.
All right. So moving ahead to the strategies for cargo handling equipment. As context, and again, there's more detail throughout the document, the state is going to be moving ahead with amendments to its cargo handling equipment regulation, pushing for zero emissions. So there's already a lot of support that's going to be coming from the state to move towards zero emissions. These strategies are primarily focused on accelerating that transition. And as many of you know, the Port of Stockton is well ahead of many of the other ports in terms of its deployment of zero emissions equipment. So for cargo handling equipment, again, we're going to reference this electric vehicle blueprint because that's going to have a lot more detail around the transition to zero emissions and how we can support that transition. The second strategy is to seek grants to buy zero emissions equipment and help terminal operators secure those grants. And then as a sub-strategy, the port and its tenants have a number of bulldozers and loaders, these heavier pieces of equipment where there's really not a lot of zero emission technology development going on. And so it could be an interesting project to demonstrate a zero emission bulldozer or loader, something for the port to consider. The third strategy is working with the tenants to facilitate the development and implementation of zero emission terminal transition plans at each facility to make sure they're ready for zero emissions equipment. And the fourth one is to transition all port-owned equipment to zero emissions by 2030 or in advance of the state regulation, whichever is earlier when feasible. And there's a little info box in the document that describes what's meant by feasible. And a lot of that has to do with the status of the technology developments. For some pieces of equipment, there's just not a zero emissions option. But the port's intent is really to move towards, for its own equipment, which is most of the equipment, to go to zero emissions by 2030. And as a sub-strategy, beginning in 2025, any new equipment purchases will be zero emissions when feasible. The final strategy for cargo handling equipment is to set a goal to transition the tenant-owned equipment to zero emissions by 2035 or in advance of the state regulation when feasible. So the port doesn't have direct authority over the tenant's equipment. So this is going to have to be more of a partnership, getting grant funding, working on strategies together to move the tenant equipment to zero emissions. Any questions on cargo handling equipment strategies?
Renee, just one quick from my side. We did go after a grant for some heavier, for actually some dozers, and we received the grant. But the Buy America clause within the grant did not allow us to move forward with going after, we couldn't buy it, unfortunately. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah, I know other ports around the country are facing kind of the same thing. But it's we're still trying to figure out, and I think they're looking at different opportunities for exemptions, but we just haven't seen those materialize yet.
Interesting.
Barbara.
I can imagine that there may be, especially at the federal level, a certain amount of advocacy that has to be done for infrastructure support for industries in America to get moving on it. One of the things I think you should put in your wheelhouse is that when you move forward with that in a lobbying kind of capacity, you should come back to this group and gather up as many logos and signatures as you can, and do some, between government and community groups and your own tenants, do some really big sign-on letters just to kind of enable your lobbyists that you have a broad coalition, I think, that's pushing for this, because I think everyone would jump up to help you.
Thank you. No, we really appreciate that. And we'll definitely make sure that we include that in strategies moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's a great suggestion. All right, so let me move to Harborcraft, which is really focused on the tugboats. So the first, so again, for context, the state California Air Resources Board is working on Harborcraft amendments, which are imminent. I don't know, Brian, if you've got an update. They were supposed to be approved end of this year, right? I don't want to.
It's out of my wheelhouse. I don't know if Lizzie knows. I can look it up real quick though, and jump back in when I.
They're coming like very soon, and that's going to push. There's a couple things that these proposed amendments would do. Really focused on getting out the oldest Harborcraft, the ones, a lot of them don't have enough hours to, they don't run enough hours in a year to be included under the current Harborcraft regulation, but the proposed amendments make it harder to run older Harborcraft with low engine hours. So moving some of those oldest tugs out, pushing towards what's called Tier 4 engines, which are the cleanest you can get today, and giving bonuses for zero emissions tugboats. And the timeline that's under consideration right now is really looking at like mid 2020s to 2030 is going to capture most of the Harborcraft and have them transition to these cleaner engines. So with that context, and also keep in mind, there's only 6 tugs in Port of Stockton. We're not talking about a huge fleet, and there's only 2 operators. So that's good news. This is manageable. The first strategy is providing assistance for the Harborcraft operators to get grant funds to transition to cleaner tugboats and to fund zero emission tugboat demonstrations. The second is requiring Harborcraft operators to have shore power infrastructure at their berths and to use this infrastructure to eliminate at berth idling emissions. So when a tug pulls up at berth, it parks, rather than running its engines to power the lights and the air conditioning and that sort of thing, it would plug in and run its engines that way. And both of the berths have the shore power infrastructure already. So this is sort of about education to use it. The third strategy is establishing slow speed zones near homes and community facilities to reduce the noise and emissions around population centers. And then evaluating ways to phase out the oldest Harborcraft engines. So those are the tier zeros and maybe the tier ones, either through incentives or tariff requirements, but exploring ways to get those oldest tugs out of the Stockton fleet in advance of the state regulation. Any questions on that? All right, I'm going to move along to ships. So I know that we had discussions about ships in this group and how difficult it is to impose requirements, incentives on ships. They're a tough source to get emission reductions from. So we've got two strategies here. One is to conduct technology demonstrations for barge or land-based systems that eliminate at-berth emissions. There is a state regulation that's going to require the tanker vessels in Stockton to eliminate their emissions while they're at berth. So this is a good opportunity for the port to look at some demonstrations of technologies that can help them eliminate those emissions and potentially be used for other types of vessels as well. And the second strategy is developing an incentive program to encourage the cleanest ships to come to Stockton. And there's a number of ports that do have incentive programs to get they're called the tier 3 ships. Those are the cleanest engines that are available today. So that's something that the port could explore. A lot more engagement particularly with the shipping industry would need to take place to start developing that program. But ships are a large source of emissions, the largest source of emissions. So it's worth exploring. Any questions about ships? Taylor?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. What are some of the other ports in California that are providing incentive programs for that? And like, what do those incentives actually look like?
Both Port of Long Beach, Port of Los Angeles have programs. And then there's international programs actually for ship incentives. There's a program called Environmental Shipping Index or Ship Index. I can never remember if it's shipping or ship.
Ship.
Environmental Ship Index, which is a ranking system for ships and gives them a number based on how clean they are. And there's ports all over the world that provide incentives based on that program. And the level of incentive varies greatly. Could be, $500 per call, could be several thousand, even in up to $6,000 per call for some of the cleanest ships. So there's a lot of variety, but the good news is there are frameworks in place to start with.
Renee, go ahead.
I was gonna say one of the most effective strategies to reduce ship emissions is vessel speed reduction or optimization, and that's something luckily that the Port of Stockton has been doing since it's been
We
developed.
invented it. Yes.
Because you have a confined channel, and so your ships are doing that, which is very good, and that takes a lot of the emissions from the propulsion engine out of play. So,
and the only other thing I was going to say, Renee, the Green Flag program is at Port of Long Beach. Was that what was the financial incentive to go along with that? Was there any?
Yeah, so that was vessel speed reduction. But okay, so the other way to do it is discounts on fees that are charged to the shipping lines. So, the port charges various fees, so you give people a rebate or a discount on that.
and LA and Long Beach have like a bonus fee that they give, or I mean a bonus reward that they give if a tier 3 ship shows up. Those, just so everybody knows, those are very few and far between in the fleet. And actually, compared to other ports in California, your fleet is a bit newer. There were a lot more tier 2s than other ports, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. But when we looked at the fleet and presented that to your group, you have a relatively young fleet not, keep in mind that ships stick around for at least 30 years or longer. So, but you have sort of a cleaner fleet than some of your other ports to your south.
No, that's good to know. And yeah, I will say just for clarification that the ships coming to our port, they're not on liner service. This is just tramp vessels. So 70% only make one call at the Port of Stockton each year, and maybe potentially in California. I'm sorry, Mary, you have your hand raised.
No need to be sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to kind of explore a little bit, your mention here of tariff requirements. So I understand that you had called your leases that you have with your businesses that are occupying port property tariffs.
No, we call them leases.
Yeah.
And then, so your tariffs, what do you mean by tariff? Is that then the fees that he was referring to?
Yes, so that's kind of like the rules of operation and the cost structure for various services within the port.
Okay, so because you do have those terms that you can negotiate, couldn't you also be planning on, having some kind of rebate or something associated with leasing to a business that is doing everything possible to keep their emissions down?
Yes, I don't think we've had those discussions yet internally, but it's at least from my perspective, yes, we should potentially consider incentives to folks who are wanting to operate in the cleanest way possible.
Thank you.
And
I think that one of the things we should talk about too internally is kind of the incentivizing tier 3 vessels. I think that would be great. I don't know if it would make a huge impact, but it is definitely something we'll consider.
yeah, and
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to say, in building on that and Taylor's question in the chat, and with ships, it always depends. So it depends on the measure that you're looking at. So LA and Long Beach do estimate a benefit each year on the use of the environmental ship index. And the benefit there is that you get actual ship specific data, which you normally don't have access to. And the ship has to put in their actual International Maritime Organization NOx numbers that the engine was certified to, which is generally less than the standard that the ship has to meet. And so LA and Long Beach get about somewhere between 7 and 8 to 10% less NOx estimated based on that better information. So the question is did they reduce emissions while they reduce the inventory of emissions, which helps and feeds into the SIP by South Coast Air Quality Management District. The question is the harder question to answer is, do the incentives actually bring cleaner ships? And you can measure that over time. We have anecdotal data that shows that depending on the incentive level, it can. But if you think about ships, the company that is either supplying something by a ship or needs something picked up by a ship, they're outside the port, and they are and on spot charters, they may need something in South America, and they charter a ship that's nearby that is cost effective to where they need to have something picked up to brought to Stockton or vice versa. And so it's a very complicated to figure out how behavior has changed, especially on spot charter incentive programs. But but for like container ships, it's a little easier because they're more on a liner service.
So we've only got a few more minutes left in this
Yeah.
meeting, but I think it's clear from the discussion that a strategy like this needs more work, right? Like we need to really
Yeah.
get in and analyze what the impacts would be. Yeah.
And that's what we had planned. Yeah. So, yep.
Matt, you had a quick question?
Yeah, quick question and then a request. The question is there an association between the dirtiest ships in the Pacific and certain commodities? And then the request is, to Bruce's point, this is an intractable emission source. It's a lot to wrangle. And usually when you run into something like that, you can turn to behavior modifications. And we could know more about the ships that are coming to Stockton if we had more real-time data on their arrival, departure, and their engine tier. And, you know, I know everybody's got an AIS software license, and I'm just wondering if there's any way for that to be on the port's website. Because right now we get a static PDF that's an estimated manifest, and nobody really knows for sure when they come or not. But some of these ships come and they spend a lot of time here. And I know that'll be moot once they're on shore power, but we basically get factories that show up burning fuel oil. And if I knew that that was happening from 7 a.m. till noon, my asthma mitigation cohort could know that information. They could stay out of a surge of NOx. So just more information for the public on ship tier frequency arrivals and departures that's out there. I almost bought an AIS script myself. But then again, you have more money than I do.
So Matt, I think that's a great, because we're going to talk a little bit about reporting if we've got time, basically how we track our progress, because we want to make sure that we're tracking it and reporting it back. So I think that's something good to note in terms of data collection and what we might need to make sure that we're tracking the effectiveness of the program.
Cool.
Yeah.
Does anybody on here have a quick fire answer for the association between certain commodities and the dirtier ships?
That is a complex question. So the short answer is no, but because I would have said the ships types that call Stockton are usually dirtier. But it turns out that you have like I said, a fairly young fleet. So a great question, very hard to answer, but the simple answer is no. But we could try to inform on that later.
Okay, thanks.
One note though is that the ships that show up in Stockton are generally not power intensive while at berth compared to other types of vessels. So and we can give you more information about that for context as well. So that's one thing that's good.
So I'm going to do rail and the other strategies all at once to get through them. Some of these should be very familiar to this group because a lot of them come from the community emission reduction plan. But for rail, so we do have a discussion about the differences between the types of rail. There's line haul locomotives, which are the Union Pacific, the BNSF that go across states. And then there's the switching locomotive operations, the short line rail that takes place within the port. And there's more opportunities there. So the first strategy is seeking grants to help rail operators transition to the cleanest available locomotives and to demonstrate zero emission technologies. The second strategy is evaluating the possibility of contractual conditions with Central California Traction Company, which is the short line rail operator, to deploy cleaner locomotives in advance of the state locomotive regulation. CARB is also working on a regulation to clean up the locomotives. So those are some strategies for rail. And then we've got sort of this bucket of other strategies, which includes the port's fleet of on-road light duty vehicles and some heavy duty vehicles. So these are like street sweepers, maybe pickup trucks that go around the port, passenger cars that are used for the fleet. And the strategy there is to transition the port's fleet to zero emissions by 2035. Beginning in 2024, all new vehicle purchases will be zero emissions, again, if it's feasible, because there's some technology limitations. By 2030, the port's light and medium duty fleet of vehicles, cars, SUVs, some pickup trucks will be zero emissions if feasible. And then by 2035, all other vehicles in the fleet will transition to zero emissions. The second strategy around fleet is, again, the electric vehicle blueprint that's going to map out the infrastructure, the funding, the needs to get to zero emissions for the fleet. We've got a strategy around vegetative barriers, evaluating potential locations for vegetative barriers, working with the community to install such barriers. And then the last strategy is expanding the port's urban greening program through more tree plantings. So again, many of these strategies, the work is already underway. This is really sort of documenting these strategies for the port and making sure that there's some accountability in terms of future reporting. Questions? I see Douglas has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, there was a proposition in California that I don't know if it's 90 or something, I don't know, where they were supposed to make an infrastructure for cars or for people who are trying to, did they pass? Did they lose? What, did anybody know, remember that?
I don't think I'm aware of that. Does anyone else have any information?
There was something on the ballot, I think, for this, and it had to do with zero emissions infrastructure. I'm not remembering.
Yes, yes.
Yep, Jonathan put in the chat, it was Prop 30.
Okay.
Oh, Prop 30, yeah, that's the one. Have been beaten or that is, or still, we're still ahead? Because I know that, like, we're talking about putting infrastructure on electrical vehicle, but if it's not going to pass, how are we going to able to make that happen? That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think you bring up an excellent point. The infrastructure is a huge challenge, and that's the importance of the port doing that electric vehicle blueprint, which is going to explore some of those challenges around infrastructure. There are a lot of funding programs that already exist for infrastructure. That's the good news. So there are funds that are out there. The port has taken advantage of a lot of those programs already. But yeah, that would have been another one, if it had passed, that would have added to that pot. So quickly, I just want to point out a couple of other things in terms of some timing for near term and long term in terms of implementing these strategies. And then we do have a section on accountability, transparency, sort of what are the performance metrics, the reporting mechanisms, and the frequency. And would love everyone to, I'm going to stop sharing now, but would really love everyone to take a good look at this plan. I do think we need to add some language around the opportunities for advocacy, because that's, and especially having the community support for that. But then as other comments come up, feel free to send them to Jeff and we'll incorporate them.
Yes, absolutely. And in the notes or in the chat, Mary Elizabeth asked about putting the emission related to types of commodities in our annual report. Will let us think about that. We may, I'll follow up with Bruce and Renee, but it may be challenging to try to figure that out. But if we can, we will figure out how best to kind of convey it to the group, because it could change. I mean, if we put it in the annual report, I mean, that could change pretty frequently. And it's almost like I use the thought process. It's almost like getting an Uber or a cab. You don't know what vehicle you're going to get. You kind of go out there and you try to get a ship to bring your cargo. You don't have, you can specify, I guess, certain things, but for the most part, it's just like next best available.
Yeah, and you've got to be careful of unintended consequences too, right? If you specify a certain type of truck or a certain type of ship that it's not available, sometimes you actually cause bottlenecks in the supply chain that worsen emissions. So it's always this balance of, you know, wanting to do the right thing, but also balancing those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, the chat is very active. We will definitely, for the solicitation for comments, are you guys going to do a social media push for solicitation of comments? That is something we can look at for sure. Jonathan, let's see. Vessels. Okay. Well, we'll go through the rest of it and respond to everybody, but I did just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. We'll follow up. Was there any last remarks from Bruce or Renee, or are you guys good?
No, I think we're good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, we are gonna take December off, so hopefully we'll give everybody a little bit of time to do and you know, spend some time going over the plan and developing some good comments. I would also, if anybody wants to reach out and have a separate meeting, we're happy to do that and sit down and talk about you know, some of the measures we're proposing, and happy to do that as well. So just let us know, and we appreciate everybody coming today. This was a great turnout, really good dialogue, and we'll look forward to seeing you in January if I don't hear from you sooner.